Welcome back to NHL 101. This is a series of videos that I will be throwing in here and there to help fans get caught up to what this whole hockey business is in the first place. Whether it's because they're excited for the new team in Seattle and trying to get caught up by the first time puck drops for the Kraken, or I guess any other potential reason somebody might be getting into hockey, these videos are very much going to be targeted at newer fans. So if you are a longtime fan of the NHL or really just hockey in general, you might not get as much out of these, but maybe you have a friend who is interested, or maybe you're just trying to get them into hockey against their will. Either way, this is probably more going to be for them. And this video is going to be about as basic as it gets as we go over the structure of an NHL regular season, or at least a typical NHL regular season, how the standings work, and how the playoffs work once it gets to that point. Now, I will emphasize that this is going to be based on a typical NHL regular season, which for reasons you can probably figure out we are not having at this point in time, and really haven't had for a couple of years now. But assuming we do finally get back to the usual flow of things in the NHL, this is what it looks like. By the way, if you do find yourself enjoying this video for any reason and you like to enjoy things, the subscribe button can help you out. The NFL. Wait, I thought this was about the NHL. Don't worry, it is. We'll get to that in just a second. But we start with the NFL, king of the sports world in North America. It's a league whose season is split up into 16 games across 17 weeks. Or, I guess, soon to be 17 games across 18 weeks. But either way, the reduced number of games adds to an extra level of intensity for each game as teams fight to accrue the most wins and also fewest losses by the end of the regular season in order to make the playoffs. Now, sure, usually when it comes to the end of the regular season, there are usually some tiebreakers involved to determine who makes some of those playoff spots and the seedings and all that. But again, it's a pretty straightforward process. Win more games than most of the rest of the teams, and you get to the postseason. And if you don't like having to think about tiebreakers, at least nearly as frequently anyway, and you think you can handle counting to 162, then the MLB regular season might be for you. Where again, it's pretty simple. Each team plays 162 games that they either win or lose, and by the end, the teams that have won the most make the postseason. Which, I mean, I say that's simple, but the Mariners have been trying to make the playoffs for almost 20 years now. So, yeah. Anyway. And then somewhere in the middle of that, we find the NBA with their 82-game regular season, again with wins and losses determining the standings. It's an 82-game regular season length that they share with the NHL, so if you're a fan of one of those three sports and the NBA in particular, and you're just now coming to hockey, you might think to yourself, sweet, I've already got this figured out. Right up until you look at the NHL standings for the first time. Now you might look at this for the first time and think to yourself, what the f*** are these points things? Are they just basing their standings off of which teams score the most points? That seems kind of dumb. Well, first of all, I should probably give you some more credit. You probably didn't actually think that that's how they determine standings, but the system is really not as complicated as it looks at first glance. Now, if you do happen to be a fan of soccer, well, for one, I'm afraid that's not something we have in common, but you probably did pick up on how this works a little bit faster. Because ties are quite a bit more common in soccer, most leagues have come up with different ways to determine their standings beyond just wins and losses, in order to recognize that ties are in fact better than losses, but nowhere near as good as a win. For example, at least in the Premier League and even MLS, the standings are determined again by points, much like the NHL, where a win is worth 3 points and a tie is worth 1 point. Now that is pretty much how the NHL system works, except for instead of 3 points for a win, they give out 2 points for a win. Although 3 points was brought up as a possibility in 2004, but was eventually rejected, and they have just stuck with the 2 points for a win. Now, of course, the other key difference is that in North American sports, we do not like ties very much, and as a result have almost entirely gotten rid of them in our sports. So while there still is the rare tie here and there in the NFL, in the NHL they got rid of ties entirely in 2005 following the lockout, with games now being decided by shootout if they aren't decided in overtime. But although we are now more than 15 years removed from the last time there was a tie in the NHL, that 1 point that they used to give to teams for getting a tie is still very much there, and is now instead awarded to teams that lose in overtime or shootout. So when you look at the record line for an NHL team, the numbers you see will be their wins, losses, overtime losses, and then their points, with the points once again being 2 for every win and 1 for every overtime loss. And again, just to be clear, yes, the team that wins the game gets 2 points regardless of when they won it, whether it was in regulation, overtime, or even in shootout. So this does mean that a team's win percentage and points percentage are two different things, and that a team could end up lower in the standings even if they have more wins, just by having fewer overtime losses. And just as an example of this, when it comes to the all-time record for best NHL season by any team, well, the 2018-2019 Tampa Bay Lightning have the most wins with their 62-win regular season that year. But the most points by a team in a regular season goes to the 1976-77 Montreal Canadiens, who had 132 points on 60 wins and 12 ties. Meanwhile, the Tampa Bay Lightning had just 4 overtime losses, so they ended up with 128 points. And if this whole point system seems a little bit silly to you now that they've done away with ties in the NHL, well, all I can really say to that is that you are definitely not alone in that thought. But moving on to more of the structure of the typical NHL season, once again, as I mentioned earlier, it is an 82-game regular season, with the 32, or I guess soon to be 32 teams, split into 4 8-team divisions, which are then organized into 2 16-team conferences. Now, I should say that it's more of a likely 82-game regular season than a sure thing for the 2021-22 season, as we have yet to see any kind of an official schedule from the NHL, and probably won't until after the season. Because although the NHL season has consisted of 82 games since the 95-96 season, with a few hiccups here and there, I do think that it's fairly likely we go back to an 84-game regular season sometime in the near future. And I say that because the way the schedule currently works has those 82 games divided up into 32 games that are played against the teams from the other conference, 2 against each team, 24 games that are played against each team from the other division in your conference, 3 against each of those teams. And then when it gets to your division, things get a little bit more complicated because with 82 games, all that's left is then 26 games, which doesn't divide evenly into 7. So if they're to keep a similar schedule to their current one with a total of 82 games and messing around with how many times you play your division rivals, which is what they've done in the past, it would probably end up meaning that each team would play 5 of their division rivals 4 times as normal, and 2 of their divisional rivals just 3 times. Which is part of the reason that I say an 84-game season is likely in the future, because by adding 2 games, you could just round that off to an even 28 games in the division, meaning that you play each of your divisional rivals 4 times. Plus, with all the money the NHL has lost during COVID, I do think the sound of adding a couple of extra games to make their schedules a little bit cleaner and adding that extra gate revenue would probably be something they would look pretty closely at. And if it turns out the NHL is dedicated to sticking with an 82-game regular season, there really is no way around the fact that the schedule is just going to kind of look ugly with the current division setup. But if the NHL is destined to go back to an 84-game regular season, it isn't probably likely to happen until after the next CBA, which don't worry too much about what that is, but it won't be for a couple of years. So when it comes to, the Seattle Kraken, for example, they'll be playing each of the teams in the Eastern Conference twice, each of the teams in the Central Division, which is the other division in the Western Conference, 3 times, and then when it comes to their own division, they'll play 5 of the teams 4 times, and 2 of the teams just 3 times. With again the goal being accruing enough points over those 82 games to make the playoffs at the end of the season. And all they need to do in order to do so is to be one of the 3 teams from the Pacific Division at the end of the year that has the most points, or to be one of the 2 wildcard teams from the Western Conference that has the most points that wasn't one of the top 3 teams in either the Pacific or Central Division. In the end, with half of the NHL's then 32 teams making the playoffs. Now when it comes to the NHL playoffs, which are fairly well regarded as being the best playoffs in all of sports, which doesn't have as much to do with the structure of the playoffs and has more to do with the consistent amount of parity and intensity of play that they have. They have had a number of different ways of being structured throughout the years, but since 1980 have consisted of 16 teams in a 4-round tournament to reach the Stanley Cup. And to be a little bit more specific with how seeding works, since the 2014 playoffs, the NHL has gone back to what is known as the divisional format for the playoffs. This means that instead of just taking the 8 teams that make the playoffs from each conference and seeding them 1 through 8 and just matching them up accordingly, they do it by division instead. So the 1 seed from each division faces one of the 2 wildcard teams, and then the 2 and 3 seeds from each division face off against each other, with the winners of those games playing each other in the second round without doing any kind of reseeding. And much like both the NBA and MLB, the rounds are determined by the winner of a series of games rather than just a single game like in the NFL. And in the NHL's case, each of these rounds is determined by the winner of a 7-game series, meaning that there's only one team that can win 16 games throughout the course of the playoffs, and that team wins the Stanley Cup. And much like the awarding of the Stanley Cup ends the NHL season, this will bring me to the end of this video. So hopefully this cleared up at least some of your potential questions around how the season, standings, and playoffs work in the NHL. If not, feel free to let me know down in the comment section below and ask any clarifying questions. Otherwise, if you have made it to this point in the video, thank you very much for watching. If you did like or enjoy it, there are buttons for that kind of stuff down below. If you have any other questions, you can also leave those in the comment section. Otherwise, until next time, stay safe out there and be good to each other. Peace.